Hello everyone, today we talk about late medieval English army's organization and more specifically the still surviving levy system in this period that of course was a general service requirement accompanied, as we will see now, by a recruitment procedure that essentially all countries in a way or another had, right? This is the initial levy system based on the idea that, again, the freeman has to serve in arms, actually paying for his own panoply. And, of course, by this point being, however, supplied further by the state, and with specific conditions, namely the usual one of, in fact, stemming from feudal times where these were codified normally to also to this specific extent of condition, that is for just a bit more than 1 month, just within the boundaries of the realm. This is important because, as I was saying, every country fundamentally maintained in an age like this one, essentially the start from the late 13th century until the end of the Middle Ages, would always have, also beyond the Middle Ages, and is basically still existing, like in cases of national emergency, martial law, and is disposing, of course, the coact levy of virtually every able-bodied citizen that, at least for the sake of combat, then of course today things are a bit more complicated in a broader juridical and administrative point of view, but they are not different in the essence from what always existed in human communities from in a way or another. The reason why this is important is that we tend to underestimate, generally speaking, how, in spite of the rise of professionalism and the great crisis of the mid-14th century, of course, the potential involvement of the population in war, regardless of how effectively could the state collude, which naturally is by scale, for example, not at all similar comparatively to, a later draft, like in the case at least of English history, just in pretty rare but also significant eventualities, to say the Napoleonic Wars, the two world wars, etc., that of course reflect the important degree of militarization of the population, and how, of course, a war made at that time required much less sort of previous training. Even armament, as we've seen, was essentially a requirement you had as a freeman to provide on your own. Naturally, in late medieval times, things started to change, as we were saying, because there is, first of all, a decay of public authority, and there is in part a refeudalization of the system. England, in this sense, is actually very advanced as far as the indenture system, which is essentially a paid service that the state can afford, right? That is essentially also what basically any other country is doing in a way or another. We've seen it for the recruitment of the French army. The condotta, for example, is the same identical thing. So every country actually has this tendency of just mostly not forcing large amounts of people to go at war. First, because most of these people are not that good at fighting to begin with. Then this is how essentially like the same feudalism had developed. The majority of the people worked in order to provide very few people, and mostly the mounted, armored elite, right, in this case, aside from the fact that the English preferred to dismount. But still, every man-at-arms was to actually and preferably fight on horseback. The reason why they would typically not do that in the major engagements of the 100 Years' War has not much to do with a sort of doctrinal English bias, right? It's something dictated by the strategic and tactical contingencies. I made a video about the Battle of Poitiers if you're interested in that specifically. And of course also because the monetization of economy, the power concentration of authority, the development of administrative institutional organisms allows for the much more effective way of accumulating wealth, which would automatically attract people to fight, and so people that are also normally in the business as professionals or at least volunteers, and that will thus offer the availability of a more restrained, numerically restrained, but still militarily effective force that you can send here and there with just also minimal political and social pressure. As we all understand now, still general levy could be called, right? Mostly was fractioned on a comital shire base. There were instances of, say, the entire kingdom mobilizing, but even in that case you realize that the ultimate amount of troops provided was much smaller than, of course, any, say, potential absolute, right? So that's also another very interesting topic, because we're not talking just about the armed peasants, but the same men-at-arms potential, for example. That's an important aspect, because many of these people, especially in the previous centuries, while not being particularly willing to serve in the army, would still lead their own private armies and intensively participating, leading their scene, fighting, and so on. There is, I would say, and I say it very much around also from the bigger channels, this tendency of stressing how small medieval armies were. This may be the impression, especially in, late medieval England, as far as not just the general political restraints, but, for example, the difficulties to embark largely, finding probably even the naval means in ensuring, in fact, the crossing, also in case of withdrawal of large amounts of men in France. A France that was also politically divided, and so it's not like these systems were reflecting an incapacity to field more. Let's say if England had been threatened, right, by some invasion that had occurred also in the past and would be a possibility also later, would actually field much larger forces. In fact, it is absolutely normal in late medieval Europe to see pretty large armies, also during the 14th century, especially actually at the beginning of that century, of tens of thousands of men. But there is a slight bias to see things a bit from the lens of just northwestern Europe, specifically, not Central Europe, not southwestern Europe, etc. And getting the impression of these irremediably small armies and or sort of ridiculously inflated figures otherwise. This may be a specific English issue for political strategic reasons. England was a powerful, compact country. Actually, its success during its tactical strategic achievements during the 100 Years' War are a reflection of that. We tend to, let's say, attribute too much stability to these political systems to the point of saying, okay, so if the English were just winning all the time, like they were in a much better place than the French were. In a sense, it is true, but had, say, they lost just either of Crécy, Azincourt, the English would have probably faced sort of implosion, right? They had already had severe problems connected with the strains between the monarchy and the barons, and comparatively to France, regardless, in fact, the severe crisis that the latter underwent, it's not just much that the French won in the end, which is kind of obvious. and it happens, you would say, but that especially as a country, they developed a much more advanced statute system with a much more effective peripheral and central administration, a much greater stratification of a much bigger state to begin with compared to England, also a general political and juridical culture that attributed to the king some prerogatives that instead in England, since the Magna Carta and the later constitutions connected essentially with the defeat of the monarchy and in the continent at the beginning of the 13th century, were really unconceivable, and that in fact inform a great part of, say, common law, broader philosophy and identity still today, and that partially, in fact, even come probably from a historiographical point of view to undermine the power of states during the same Middle Ages. In fact, essentially the English kingdom, albeit having, for example, in the Anglo-Norman era, a pretty good and, to say the least, by the way, actually and possibly the most advanced public, like central system, especially until the White Ship wreckage, with an important degree of central, monarchic officials, did not. It sort of employed a point, baronial wars, general rebellions, the Magna Carta settlement, and all what was consolidated, especially during the rest of the 13th century, brought to the maintenance just of, again, a monarchy and the barons as local lords without too many intermediaries, with especially, in fact, the barons ruling as lords of the local seigneury without too much further, say, interference and or also local administrative development that would be particularly connected with the monarchy and so on. This is important when looking at the developments of the English military during this point, as it highlights, in fact, how, for example, effective indenture came to be, considering the relative dysfunctionality of the previous feudal system of recruitment. Not much because of the form, or at least because this had not fundamentally developed due to the power balance within the king. That, however, at the end of the 13th century was also a pretty solid one, right? It arguably reached its greatest peak, its greatest effectiveness, say, from Edward the First to Edward the Third, monarchically wise, and it being really a great set. Otherwise, it would have not produced the military system of the success of which was displayed during the 100 Years' War. Everything is the reflection of one another. We'll talk about Edward the Third, has never really done it adequately, and sort of this we saw at Poitiers what his son had as a mean at his disposal. Even in a condition of objective military inferiority there, that however bit the French out of sheer, in that sense also surely of leadership, right, and contingency and many other issues, but definitely having very solid fundamentals, at least as a as a great kingdom of Christendom. Now, we can start from Edward the First Statute of Winchester, enacted in 1285, because this is essentially the levy system in vogue during the same dawn of the 14th century, so a time in which the English army was developing further towards that peak of effectiveness. Remember always that the English army of the 100 Years' War, in terms of symmetry, say, the French and the English did not really differ much in a civilizational sense. If anything, the English were probably slightly backwards, but technically wise, in terms of material culture, etc. We're talking about essentially the same people, the same army. And in terms of numerical parity as well, definitely the English armies of the period are the strongest army in the entire history, meaning that there is not a single, which of course is a relative statement. This doesn't mean that the English armies of the 100 Years' War were, I don't know, something you can compare to, I don't know, other armies, or especially in other times in history. And also we have the example of the French versus the English. We do not know what the English would have done necessarily in other contexts with larger armies, even when they serve, for example, as very good individual units. However, being an army mobilized by people is something slightly different, and you should also understand always the context of who was behind also armies on the move, such as the ones of like the White Company, etc. There's no doubt, however, that if the White Company was considered as the most successful one in the age of soldiers of fortune, it was because of the English military culture and, of course, the great experience matured during the 100 Years' War. But really, in terms of parity, there is no army that beat such superior forces, numerically wise, in such a, say, undeniable succession like the one of in the battles of the 100 Years' War, like the English did with the French. So we didn't talk too much about medieval English warfare, considering, say, the many topics that we covered for other countries. Of course, we get pretty thorough with every single people and every single detail, military units and so on. It's obvious that today's video does not include other very important chapters and say units and sort of other forms of organization that the English had. We're looking at the basic sort of levy that existed still at this point, that was never crossed out of the option, just even to stiffen the ranks with enhanced numbers, etc. But that hadn't become sort of the most effective, the most rewarding of the recruitment means. Now, the aforementioned Statute of Winchester mandated that men with land valued at £40 serve as knights, those with 20 serve as men-at-arms, those with 15 serve as mounted infantry, those with 10 serve as infantry in accutants, and those with between £2 and £5 serve as archers armed with bow, sword, and knife. The men with less than £2 were required to serve with a bow and arrows, if they owned them, right? Otherwise, they were to carry a sword, knife, and any other weapon available to them. What you listen to is the typical, in kind, segmentation of recruits by census and parallel armament that was expected really from anyone. I can't think of any people that didn't have, in a way or another, this type of selection. This is important because, of course, it shows how at the end of the 13th century, also under such an important and military active ruler like Edward I, of course, there is a pretty serious stringent set of standards on those who are participating. Like the economical considerations for the cost of the time, require sort of more in-depth analysis. As we were saying before, much of it would be flawed because in any case this statute would not really apply itself through the recruitment of all people on this basis. We'll see now how the thing really happened. Not all people, even just in places where this would be in a territorial sense applied. All right. Of course, there were lots of impediments, lots of shortcomings, lots of inefficiencies. It's a pre-industrial system. There wasn't much of a coercive capacity. However, there was a general interest that was the one also behind the existence of the same government for example, waging war against Wales, against Scotland. Now, £40, so here the difference between knights and men-at-arms is interesting, because the knight, of course, would correspond to a higher form of nobility that was sanctioned in this strictly military sense, that had to be reflected by a certain set of qualities of condition of just wealth, but as a consequence, the dubbing, the presence of a certain retinue, of certain moral and physical standards that here represent really the very elite, right? Half of that is the man-at-arm, which in this period is a figure which has sided for good next to the knights, right? At the end of the 13th century witnesses essentially the parification in technical terms of within heavy cavalry in the West, heavy cavalry which accounts mostly also for the entirety of cavalry by this point. Yes, there were some mounted archers of sort that we tend to sort of underestimate, but they also belong to a time in which the military standards were lower, and in fact that would bring to the fair containment of these individuals, especially at this time, as a type of trooper. If in the face of the compactness of heavy shock cavalry, so to the point that you couldn't distinguish within these milites, in fact, who was a knight or a man-at-arm purely by their panoply and their skills. And there were, however, all the difference in retinue was more than else the discriminant there. So those who had historically been the squires now served mostly as heavily armored cavalrymen themselves, and maintain, in fact, the sort of top level of basic equipment. It would have been like a knightly one, except without the higher requirement of status and retinue that a knight would. These people would have their own field aids, and so the way we know about these things is transverse sometimes, because we don't have all the evidence we would like, but we know it's there. We know especially that, as we were saying before, there were ever more people that could serve as men-at-arms without having any particular feudal obligation. That's why this levy existed, because in theory all freemen had to serve if adequately armed, and some of these would be the same people eventually that would just volunteer for an expedition in exchange of money, for a living, of course. Then we have this interesting figure like of the mounted infantryman that entails some lower standards in panoply, 15 compared to 20 but of the men-at-arms, but as you see, not as distant as for the knights, which is technically still a cavalryman, but one that is not meant to be excessively reliable in that vest, and that can work essentially as an armiger, also as an infantryman. Remember, in this period, the English cavalrymen would tend to dismount more often than not, especially after their defeats against the Scots. Here we're not there yet. I made a video about the early phases of, say, Edward's harassment of Scotland, but there was in part a tendency already inherent to the fact that it's obvious that confronting certain pretty infantry-based enemies that could adopt pretty compact defensive formations, and or having to fight, say, in places like Wales that has many wild areas that are not exactly the best for mounted troops, because the heavier ones and has to engage mostly against infantrymen in pretty serious situations like ambushes and so on, you do need probably this infantry element. Many people think that, say, there is also some prominent YouTuber talking about the era that the English had always maintained since Anglo-Saxon times a sort of preference for foot combat. This is, especially for the 13th century, not really witnessed. Like, the English military had developed really in the fullest feudal, knightly possible way. Of all the battles of 13th century England, we do not see anymore like that objective infantry dismounting, or also some basic fighting capacity among the heavier troops that, yes, had existed before, and probably also England had since, in fact, the migration era, but that you found, in fact, up to the mid-12th century, basically everywhere in Europe, right? The cavalry starts becoming really the decisive arm, meaning not just the stronger one, but probably the one that cannot be contrasted in open ground during the 13th century, right? As we were saying before, actually, the Celtic Fringe is a place where the battlefield, the terrain is so unsuited to heavy cavalry to an extent that, yes, you find it there, but this is exactly the problem. It's not like conventional warfare, like in the previous centuries, where, I don't know, entire armies, like even the ones of the Holy Roman Emperor, dismounted at times to fight on tougher ground, because cavalry was not so fully developed, say, in the feudal knightly fashion, but still in a broadly conventional warfare, right? The Celtic Fringe does not have that kind of Latin Germanic conventional warfare that by now is becoming really homogeneous pretty much all over the post-Frankish West, right? And beyond, including England, that was not that had never been a Frankish possession. And that tells you, of course, of how impacting it had really been, regardless of the fact that, yes, the Normans had invaded and conquered the de facto the island, but, of course, would have not been able to develop that feudal chivalric warfare on their own, hadn't there been, in fact, an Anglo-Danish society capable of sustaining that. So you need to be flexible. And remember, this is the time of Edward I, so there are French adventures at a point, but they're somewhat contained. Most warfare is British in nature, and so against the Celtic Fringe from the English side, and that's also what can remind you of the importance of these forces. Consider, we're not talking mercenaries here. It was plenty of forces from, in fact, also the Celtic Fringe as mercenaries and something. Not as many, however, and this is also important to stress, as the ones the English nationally relied on their own. In fact, the entire story that the English, say, archers were mostly actually Welsh, and that the Welsh had a superior archer to the English one, is a complete myth that has been debunked from generations now. As a matter of fact, the English archers recruited from some of the most famed woodmen communities in the kingdom were paid even more than the Welsh. And if anything, the reason why we see so many Welsh archers is that they were poorer than the average English recruited. They would serve as mercenaries as well, so also technically through other means of recruitment at a point, even though they started being blurred because Wales was not treated that differently as a subject land. In any case, we see, in fact, here also you can imagine in a hierarchical distribution of the pool of these troops how potentially there were much less knights, saying that anyone down the role, right? So in theory, this should correspond to at least when an army was summoned in that to that kind of proportion, but it's not quite like that, right? It's not entirely like that, because still the need to have a certain amount of troop type rather than another was not even properly decided, first of all, because during campaigns pretty interesting things happen, also against any control. Then you have allies, people who start flocking or say to or abandoning your army, and you have a different degree of attrition of desertion, in fact, for all these forces. So everything was calibrated in a much more empirical way. Remember that statutes in general are just dispositive sources. They do not actually tell you much about what armies looked like in the end. Of course, we can see this importance, this disparity between the various types of troops, but that's as far as we can obviously also understand from, aside from the price, etc., from all the other evidence at our disposal about, say, medieval English warfare. So you see infantry in Aquitans, and then archers with bow, sword, and knife, and the poorest echelon serving with bow and arrows if they had them. Otherwise, they were to carry a sword and knife. So it's either you're a bowman or you can somehow stab. Consider that by the 14th century, this is especially true for soldiers proper, meaning these are not soldiers, right? These are just people who must fight if the kingdom asks them to do through their representatives. But say among the indentures, even the aforementioned poor Welsh archers, by 14th century economic standards, would have not had that great difficulty to have a sword, for example. In fact, we know that they had that. And say things had really changed. It had come a long way by that point. So that you have, for example, with the crisis of 14th century, still, yes, there is a general impoverishment of the population, but it's not like production, for example, especially of the most expensive tools. I'm not talking the swords necessarily, because yes, they were fairly expensive, but it depends also on the quality of them. But say it becomes more organized, more corporative in a way that also allows for relatively cheaper, but still substantial, in fact, even weapons in this case, to be obtained by the troops. Here, I will not also comment excessively on the obvious fact that even if these troops had to provide for their own equipment, and this is not, as you understand, the only or not even the prevalent, in certain instances, type of army organization, recruitment, and composition, if not in the very age of Edward I, especially for wars within the same Britain at least. But in the Turk's case, everything was so much more privately managed that, of course, those who were hired were veritable mercenary companies to an extent. The mercenary company is not just the more famous later one, where you can have, I don't know, in the Condottieri's age, like an entire army that is a mercenary company. Companies were really the basic universal name for any sort of what had historically been a war band of, in fact, of soldiers that you could hire, sometimes as few, in fact, as, a few knights. That the English, we will see it later, normally will attach to those, also in later times, a disproportionately large amount of archers, as a matter of fact. Before I was saying that, yes, at this point there is not a great deal of horse archers, but in the 14th century things will change back again, in part because these archers would also dismount a lot. This is especially the English case. Of course, there are, say, mounted crossbowmen, also mounted archers in other countries, but aside from Spain, for example, where the fighting a la jineta was a big deal, like in other countries, yes, we find maybe, I don't know, in southeast Germany, mix a bit with the Hungarians and the Slavs, the sort of more almost steppe-flavored type of cavalry, but overall, throughout this period, today we don't give ourselves a limit in the 15th century, but the evidence is mostly from the 14th, right? And so at that point, most, say, conventionally speaking, Western cavalry is heavy stuff, men-at-arms, the so-called barbute. You have different names depending where you are looking, have really the dominance of the situation. Infantry as well, after the first half of the 14th century, is not that particularly strong, and it's just in certain parts of Europe that it manages only at that point to regain the upper hand over cavalry, but it's not for good, right? The mid-14th century destroys that. You have to wait another century before infantry comes back, really, with the Swiss, and through the very different model from the one that these times rustics or bourgeois really had done in a quite sort of very often fringe way, not necessarily underdeveloped way, but say definitely in an unprofessional fashion. With the only exception of the English, that however in that sense were a royal army, so something extremely different that marks the English exception for what it was really. If you're not familiar with these concepts, I know I could slow down, but I think they're also a bit like the essentials of English warfare of the period. You should know more or less what I'm talking about, and I discussed it in many other videos. The point I was making is that these levies were technically to present themselves with their own arms and armor, but it's obvious that already by this point, de facto, the English monarch would bring with him a lot of material, supplies, including arms and armor. So, of course, the romantic myth of the guy that leaves with not just his own handmade arms and armor, something he purchased himself, and his cheese or, provisions for a certain amount of time that were also required in theory, ever was the prevalent model. At this point, such, say, a civilized country like England had a very important central control. We know that especially England had a great homogeneity in the military administration. For example, under the same Edward I, there were certain specific royal officials that supervised the necessity of stocking uniformly made trebuchet projectiles, right? While during the same 13th century in other parts of Europe, this happened as well, in fact, in others, in more advanced, but normally stones were sort of cut on the spot, right? Were not even carried for that reason. You could find them, but they could be more, say, heterogeneous. You could have problems with the same ways you would stock and transport them. The English were very well organized in this sense, and this is definitely a plus, a very good indicator of what the monarchy had managed to consolidate within a virtually entirely British dimension, aside from the the few English possessions left on the continent. In a tidy and sort of consistent fashion that especially Edward I's campaigns are an excellent demonstration of. Service, going back to the statute, was historically compulsory for all men aged 16 to 60 for a period of 40 days each year. This is very basic. 16 to 60 was like a way to say, okay, every able-bodied male, in theory, 40 days is an interesting parallel with feudal limitations of feudal military service. Also considering that, of course, we see knights, men-at-arms. So the people that, as we're pointing out before in previous centuries, had to form, at least ideally, the backbone of this levy. Monetization, military service had already been a thing from quite a while. You can argue that, say, the vassalic beneficiary system was never really functioning the way on paper, on parchment, it was supposed to, right? It had always to be this kind of extra service. We talked about this. This had involved also the same England. For example, it happened within the same country, but also the Duchy of Normandy regulated this with the King of France, and it was normally, in fact, a certain basic amount of days each year, like these 40 was really typical, plus some additional contribution, and basically they arrived to just having just a direct monetization of the service, and so that's why also the entire feudal recruitment as such was basically useless at a point. And given that there was a gradual oligarchization of the same nobility, of knighthood, as we have seen, and this was true since the 3rd, 4th of the 12th century, those men would normally participate to military campaigns with their retinues, with their locally recruited forces, just because they were co-opted by the monarchy in one way or another. They were sharing the same bonds, the same assets, the same power as a country, and therefore they, considering also how competing they were with one another, and the same monarchy were always participating, and or at least being heavily involved. Now, the typical procedure for mobilizing the troops, like in the statute, involved the king issuing a commission of array. This commission authorized designated individuals to summon both counties and towns to provide military personnel. Very simple concept. You have to send people endowed with a certain coercive power, but also a general reputation and status, to enforce recruitment. And these officials need, in fact, to provide the adequate troops for the campaign. Things would never be perfect. That's why this was really crucial. Of course, the commissioners were not just powerful people, but also by that condition often militarily experienced. So they would know also how to handle this at a local level, select the best men to have the necessary contacts, right, to make things work as smoothly as possible. In fact, the commissioners were usually knights themselves. Occasionally, even members of the knight's household. I made a video about the Familia Regis of Henry I just recently. It's definitely not the same time, but it's not even that enormously distant, so you understand what kind of men those were, what kind of military curriculum they had on their shoulders. And they would select the required number of men specified in the commission by choosing, as it was normally the case, the strongest and most vigorous among those assembled. This is relevant because we don't have just to think about the peasantry mostly being chosen like cattle in this sense, but even the knights, right? There was a sense, especially for the higher echelons of society, this high sense of honor and of effort in being recognized as valiant fighters and men worth of their military contribution. This would bring them fame and further capacity and possibly rewards from the same expeditions that would help them locally. Needless to say, there was also a lot of, corruption or exemption from service, which was also a thing. Of course, not everybody was happy to serve, even though they maybe were well trained and well fit. At the same time, there was a way just to, behind all this, to organize the local communities for that, right? We will see it in other videos, but for example, when the English monarchs decided to actively foster greater amount of skilled archers, also actually as a mechanism against the nobility a bit, even though English infantry, albeit being quite effective, for example in France, would never stage like a revolution where they ever beat cavalry in their homeland, right? So that's yet another exception of the English army when we think of who they were fighting. Like if you look at the Scots, in a sense it's as if the English had been the masters of Britain and the Scots rebelled, right, and met them in open field. It was still a feudal country working the same way, also from terms of army organization, except they had so few surplus that the infantry was disproportionately superior, so that's how they seemed like they fought more as infantrymen. But it wasn't simply quite the case. The same was true for, the Ditmarscher, we talked about them, the Flemish, the Swiss. But that's basically it, right? You don't find much of this, especially even when infantries were disproportionately more developed than that. For example, you never find an infantry victory in Italy, even though they had literally the best infantries in Europe in absolute terms. So there is actually a lot of contact at this point across Europe. Like the English know very well. Castruccio Castracani himself, who fought against the Flemish rebels themselves, beating actually we do not know if he was in charge, but he likely did participate in the engagement. There is a late 15th century Flemish source, right? But with other, say, Tuscan Lombard infantrymen called by the King of France, and that was a favorite at the court of Edward I, right? So because as you know, the Italians were the main bankers of the situation. This great royal houses were very much connected with them, especially when it came to require financial means exactly to fund their armies. That was their greatest concern at the end of the day. The entire system basically revolved around it. A lot of money treasured for the times of war that were extremely consuming. But going back to the commissioners, these organized the recruits into units of 20, 100, or even 1,000, led by officers known respectively, in fact, as vintners, centenars, and milliners. This could be different people, sometimes the same recruits. In fact, at this point, there wasn't really a permanent cadre of officers that you could simply rely on, like in a permanent army in modern times. So, veterans, for example, among these recruits would know what to do. They would already have their fact society organized in this way with rota systems, for example. Otherwise, the commissioners themselves had held some posts at the head of the respective units to ensure the integrity of this recruitment process. The same commissioners conducted biannual inspections of the men and their arms to prevent any fraudulent activities, which means that every once in a while you had to attend the array, right, and to be inspected in your equipment, which was the most important thing. In that sense, you had, if anything, to show up. That was the most important thing, actually. And there were severe sanctions if you wouldn't. And so show that you were complying, that the community obeyed the sovereign's orders, and that you were ready for war, that you were rightly equipped and you could simply leave for campaign. The potential manpower generated by this system was consistent. But obviously not all the actual records. In fact, the most interesting aspect of this is that likely during the commissions of our reign, the moment in which they were issued after a council of the king with the nobility, with the estate, sort of threshold would be set, right? It's implausible to think that, for example, you have this example 1339, right, in which from the 37 counties of England collectively came 1,407 men-at-arms, 5,600 archers, and 5,600 armati, the latter being that typology of essentially infantrymen, melee infantrymen. I mean, the archers are missile skirmishers, essentially. And it's, yes, it's a consistent number. It's basically, making the maths, 11,200 in infantry plus 12,600 or something. It's a large force for these times. But believe me, if England had wanted to levy 30,000 men, they would have been given the right political pressure able to do so. Like, this was just like a given amount that is not considered, by the way, the additional forces that could be. Much of these people would be lost along the way. I mean, they would desert, they would be stationed just even as garrisons, etc. But plus there was the indentured, there were other, for example, royal household troops. Everything was done. Say, it was not a matter of how many men in absolute terms they would want to recruit, even it's just how they would have this pool that they would eventually select when on the actual military theater to employ against this or that objective. Right? So that's why eventually armies looked even smaller than that. And of course there are many instances of mobilized troops that were eventually not sent anywhere. It's a blurred topic because aside from certain parts of Europe that unfortunately do not include England more than much, it's in fact pretty underdocumented how things really happen. We don't really know. You see, that's what I was saying before, that between let's say the statutes as a dispositive source and the chronicles as the actual, say, narrative source, the telling, at least ex post, how many troops were mobilized, they fought in a war, in a battle, we do not often have anything. Meaning that, again, we get the dispositive source, how in theory more or less the proportion should have been, and then how the armies were actually made in the process. We have zero idea. Right? We may have an idea, but it cannot be substantiated by enough evidence. Of course, there is some hint here and there. It's not a completely hopeless task, but generally speaking, we do not see it. Right? It's not reconstructible historically. Unfortunately so, because of course it would be amazing, as it especially would reveal the actual intentions behind such forms of organization, how much they couldn't quite concretely control, how much they would sort of try to think in a really political, strategical sense. There was a lot of pressure. There was not always a great need to simply overly squeeze the country, for example. So that's also why this affects down to the tactical history, because objectively, if the English had not been so contained, probably they would have overspent, and because most of these forces would have been, much of their forces would have been lost along the way. But if you have to carry out a chevauchée and conquer a bunch of castles, you don't really necessarily need to ship 30,000 men from England, and or even putting together an army of that size on when in France through other means as well, if not to just send at least only a part of that somewhere else, because you need the reserves. You can't simply put everything you have on the field at a time. You have to protect other territories. So that's why things are that complicated. But say if, for example, the English dismounted at Crécy, at Poitiers, at Azincourt, the reason is not that they were thinking, okay, so now we will essentially go out there and fight on foot. No, the reason is that they were heavily outnumbered by the French, and that the only sensible way to cope with them was to entrench on a favorable terrain, so exploiting defense at maximum possible level, which included dismounting, because facing French cavalry face to face with that numerical ratio would have been ridiculous. You would have lost maneuverability, you would have lost some options, but at the same time, if you were that desperate and well defended in fringe areas that in fact the larger armies would have sort of have difficulty of deploying on. In fact, most of these battles, the English were in extremely dire conditions. They could have not even hoped to surrender and getting out of there, at least with their lives. You see how much stems from that also non-strictly military background, as a matter of fact. For the Battle of Neville's Cross, Yorkshire alone deployed 15 men-at-arms, 29 hobblers, and 3,020 mounted archers. Now you would say, wow, that's a lot. The only Yorkshire, there were many more troops technically available from there, right? 15 men-at-arms is objectively ridiculous for an area like Yorkshire. Okay, it's not an overwhelmingly developed place, but it's, of course, an important one, also eventually a frontier one that has even way more than 15 men-at-arms, and definitely more than 29 hobblers. Of course, the mounted archers are a lot, and this also show how, by that point, we are already into the Scottish, War of Independence. So there is already the sense that you need lots of archers to soften up the enemy's skill trend. Here it's just a fraction, it's just Yorkshire alone, but you see the same proportions also in the indentures, like just a bunch of men-at-arms and literally thousands of archers, which is actually, put in perspective, not a great compliment towards the archers for all the hyper-technologistic obsession with the longbow performance. We tend to forget that in order to achieve what they did, the English needed an overwhelming amount of archers. Like, it wasn't like, for example, the crossbowmen that did not succeed against them in these major battles were always kept in use and very well paid as well, but they were notoriously also much less than English longbowmen. And so when people compare them, but it's not just like you're comparing apples to oranges, because at the end of the day they are also still missile troops. But sometimes people don't even take into account the numbers and other factors. Again, I made plenty of considerations on this stuff in other videos about medieval infantry. In many ways I specialize in this topic, and believe me, like, the English armies were that great during the 100 Years' War, but not for the categorically structural listic reason that you may think of, nor for any specific technical performance superiority of the longbow over the crossbow. The proof being that there were countries that literally produced the longbows and shipped them to England for their armies, such as Lombardy, which is the same place where the same, for example, White Company operated at a point, with the Italians continuing overwhelming to use only crossbows, and with great effect for that matter, and like basically all the entire rest of Western Europe then. So we will have to look at this, because it's not like there was anything specific about the longbow. If anything, the reason why it seems that the English used this so much is that during the campaigns of Edward I, already before, that larger amount of peasants, we were saying before, those guys that have less than 5 pounds of land, would be many. There would be also these fringe areas, like the same northern England that we just mentioned, or Wales, or others, that would provide lots and lots and lots of these archers. Simply because they were more rural, northern European societies compared to more elaborated, affluent, southern ones, that made, in fact, a much greater use of the crossbow. Many of these men were woodsmen themselves. That's worth remembering. They were also tough people, by the way. That's important to stress. Even just in combative terms, it's not a huge deal, but those are people that you would bring to work. Essentially, it's the only ones that you can afford. And then the English essentially habituated themselves to this, because that's also what they fundamentally had. And on the basis of that, they rely on this arm that happens to be armed with bows, more or less long bows, rather than crossbows, that also existed and were used by the English, of course, as it came to be, right? And then just eventually building up on that human material, technical resources, without making much a fuss about this. Like, nobody seems to be particularly impressed by, let's say, the differences. Like, nobody feels the need to point out that, I don't know, the English had found out the ultimate weapon. If, in fact, as we were saying before, we don't even have a clear evidence that in conditions of parity there was much of a, of a distinct superiority of the longbow over the crossbow. Now, it's a very contentious topic, to say the least. Morale, leadership, and much more. Also luck, by the way. There is no great winner in history that can do without luck. It's a metaphysical, traditional concept. The Romans had an entire branch of their theology dedicated to this, and this was actually shared by everybody, the Anglo-Saxons and more. Now, regarding the organization of these levies, what did happen when they were levied by the commissioners? Well, the military service per se, was conducted at the individual's expense within his county. So that's where he literally had his own food, for example. Not always, of course. There would be ways to circumnavigate this. Remember that this, in an individual sense at least, I mean, the commissioners were to organize this whole thing. So they weren't just knocking at people's door and saying, show up because we have to put you all together and then move. Like, there was a greater way of mobilizing the local community, providing the supplies, the weapons, and so on. This is, again, 13 and later centuries England, so it's not like Stone Age. And so within the county, it made sense to be able even just to literally bring all the food needed for, say, putting down those damn brigands and then coming home. So sort of police force, right? But initially, at the county's expense until reaching the mustering point, and subsequently at the king's expense outside the county or kingdom. At that point, of course, the royal forces would have taken a bit more of matters in their own hands, so it wasn't just like that fragmented, like as we read before, the 37 counties had 37 different logistical systems. No, it did not work like that. At a small level, they kept contributing in that way, but everything was put in common at a point, at least, and so managed mostly by the royal officials and so on. And it was instead, in fact, at the king's expenses, that such military service could be performed outside the county. The king would pay anyway for that. It had to be compensated by the king in that way. Which could bring these forces pretty much everywhere across England or outside of it. The only exception was service performed to preserve the peace of our realm, as the sources say, which due to a subtle interpretation by Edward II for many years included not only the defense against the Scottish and Welsh incursions, but also military campaigns against Wales and Scotland. This is extremely important. As a matter of fact, I also made a month ago or so a video explaining how, of course, there were some say objections, resistance, not just resistance to a levy, things like that, but for the issue of not spilling, for example, other Christian blood or any blood. That was a video about pacifism as a heresy to undermine fact constituted power to begin with. So just sort of lame excuse for one's personal shortcomings and cowardice. In any case, that was important because, as we've seen with the county as well, the king essentially was expected to pay for anything that went beyond this, mostly like individual maximum horizons that a shire really was, in this terms of practical concern of safety or defense. So that's how actually traditional and primitive England still is. Remember that, of course, there are local lords that object to this, and the barons have their own strong power in the country. However, it seems also obvious that when somebody attacked the country, well, a retaliatory strike, especially against such bordering lands like Scotland and Wales, would seem actually pretty necessary. I never studied Edward II's reign in thorough detail, but we'll likely cover this soon after I adequately prepare. That he wasn't that disaster of a king that is normally conceived. At least there is, of course, as always, a bit of bad press when there are these idiosyncratic attitudes towards single sovereigns. I personally think, for example, that John of England was a great ruler, and I know that, and I understand why it's not a conventional point, but at least I spoke my mind regarding this and made a video on it, by the way. What is interesting, though, is that this practice of striking back into Wales or Scotland, because of this general need to preserve the peace of our realm, so it's, of course, a need of defense and security, would not be set aside in spite of resistance until 1404. By that time, the Parliament had been repeatedly pressuring the monarch to sort of avoid such things, which shows actually two things. First of all, this kind of counter-strike operation had been practiced, so receiving the decisive moral support of the kingdom, and or at least of those parts of it that, like not being happy to serve without adequate compensation de facto abroad, would have been the same ones damaged by the incursions. So at least they were not just seeking for revenge, but wanting to, in fact, respond in kind, which definitely the Scots and the Welsh had just sort of some means, right, to counter, because England was the bigger system. As it often happens, there is in fact this internal resistance for which, if anything, pressure existed for the monarch to at least pay entirely for these expeditions abroad. As by that point was happening just with the indenture, etc. But of course, there is an additional reason why the king would receive support to strike back in these circumstances. Edward II's attempts to further expand the obligations of the statute experienced some temporary success for these reasons. From 1316 until the end of his reign, many militia units actually served with weapons and armor that exceeded the requirements specified in the statute, with the associated costs covered by the community, showing that, of course, the same communities were willing to pay for that, and or at least they were obliged, but still, because they had something to say about that, and they decided not to, say, rise up in arms, at least together. Because, as you know, Edward would had sort of difficult times in his reign, to say at least till the end. So in at least one instance, the duration of service was extended to 60 days. However, these unconventional commissions of RA proved to be highly unpopular in general. It was sometimes just a matter of 20 days more, right? And of course that cost, you don't have to think that, in fact, all the supplies, the armament, and the general risk, right, that the operations entailed for just 20 days were just something to kid with. You have to move, in 20 days you can move 600 kilometers. Right? It's also a myth that medieval armies were slow and cumbersome and whatever. They would take their time if they could or would take their time. But normal marches were around 30 kilometers, even more a day. Sometimes it could be even double, right, in certain circumstances. So you can't really make a lot with that extra time. Petitions at the start of Edward III's reign called for common gentlemen not to be expected to arm themselves beyond what was outlined in the Statute of Winchester, and these petitions were largely supported by the new king. Nevertheless, he did not fully adhere to his promise either, as his commissions during the 30s and the 40s, of course of the 14th century, often subtly required hobblers and mounted archers to possess arms and armor superior to those specified by the statute. Which also made sense because, as we were saying before, you can't simply expect these armies to rely on, as we said before, proportion like 15 men-at-arms and basically 3,000 unarmored people. Like it's of course illogical. But there was also a narrower amount of troops that would ultimately be levied on this basis, which was a way to gradually professionalize troops. Like the 30s and the 40s of the 14th century are the moment in which, like, the commoner masses of infantry dry up drastically as suddenly, because the crisis is kicking in and it's biting hard. And so during all these wars that the English are also quite generously fighting, of course it's better just to economize, to rationalize, and that brings to, okay, let's give this soldier more. That's how you could even enforce this system to begin with, because it was not such an enormous extra cost after all, but it still was done often in exchange also for slightly less people to actually serve. And in fact, if this had not been so well equipped, the remainder had not been so well equipped, like just adding numbers would have not really helped that much. By the way, Edward's subtlety had to do with the slight alteration regarding the expectations for those who classified under the 15-pound category, requiring them to provide for the former. So, as we saw before, some sort of armored mounted trooper, which is definitely not what, in fact, the average person below 15 pounds of assets could simply provide. That's why, yes, it was an enforcement, but it was a way to basically not issue another statute, not to appear as if, officially some greater requirement was actually enforced in pretty dire times for everyone, but still telling the communities, be serious, send even less men, but send sort of a core on which we can rely. There would be revisions to the statute finally in 1345 and 46, mandating that landholders supply the following items in strict proportion to their wealth. So you have actually a cumulative ticket, which shows how, in fact, things were getting ever more towards the semi-professional, professional side of the story, even for these levies, because everything was becoming more similar to the indenture in a way. In fact, you have a 4 men-at-arms pack that for both years is based on the requirement of 100 pounds, which is not to say that this individual man had to have 25 pounds or more of assets. These were recruited on some sort of group basis. And this was a way to also functionalize the camaraderie, the sense of mutual reliance, etc. The saying goes, 2 men-at-arms, 50 pounds for both years. Then for 1346 you have men-at-arms, hobiler, mounted archer, 40. So you see it's tending towards what you would call the lax in other parts of Europe. It's the sense that these troops are recruited together and they're not finding disjuncted. They're not the levies of, say, farmers anymore. It's something way more selective for a small unit tactics functionality. 1346, men-at-arms and mounted archer, 30 pounds. Both years you have men-at-arms for 25 pounds, which, of course, as we said before, you could sort of replicate it. Surely there were at some point groups of men-at-arms with 25 pounds of assets that were levied in such a way that mostly was grouping putting even just the single contribution together, not just the men but their goods, etc., for the expedition, and making them fight also like that. In the same units that commissioners would have created ad hoc in this way, also because warfare now really and technically worked like that. The lances are specialized and professionalized. 1346, for 2 hobulars, you have 20 pounds of assets. For 1, for both years, 10 pounds. For 1345, you have a mounted archer. At least to be a mounted archer, for 5 pounds, and in 1346 to provide a mounted archer. A slight difference which hints essentially at the fact that being a mounted archer was just showing enough for at the array and being recruited. 1346 you have just to provide for someone, which is a further way to say, okay, if you don't want to serve yourself, you can send another guy. This is to be seen in many other places in Europe also much earlier than that. Think about the cavallata, for example. So you are wealthy enough, but this is the eye of the crisis. Black Death is at the gates, and everything was paving the way to that more than the Black Death causing the major contraction per se. So many people said, I don't have to just go. I want, and it's interesting that these are, in fact, the lower echelons. So while the men-at-arms would have still technically been people habituated to leave as knights to fight as de facto professional troops, the guys under 5 pounds of assets would say, but I don't really want to go. I'm just in a sense like a peasant of some sort. Yes, I may have a horse, I may even know how to use a bow from horseback, which is not something so strange, even if in Western Europe there wasn't much of that on the battlefields. But English are increasing that specifically, so that's at least the case. They would have been trained also, and partially along the way, especially for mounted, let's say collective mounted archery, which doesn't require an overwhelming amount of collective training, but at least it has to be orderly enough not to sort of smash into one another. These are not people living in the steppes that basically know how to do it since they're coming of age. And then for both years you have an archer for 2 pounds of assets. This again shows how much more collectively and technically organized the army is becoming, even in the levy element, that is yet another way to get the troops. The troops raised under the 1346 Commission of Arms included men-at-arms, armati, which means, like at least in this case, armored horsemen or mounted infantry. Armatus stands in Latin for some sort of heavily armored individual, right? Hobbilars and archers. So the standard pack here. Alright, here you see that there's not much of a difference between knights. They're not mentioned quite anymore because, as we said before, also the technical divides had sort of leveled, and as we just observed, there is a retinue mentality that is kicking in even for, in fact, this average rank and file men-at-arms, that is just a guy who knows how to fight in that kind of fashion, with the troops provided also through these forms of recruitment. These troops are a bit, are tactically complete. Like, you can have an entire army like this. And in fact, this represents also, incidentally at least, one of the largest armies that English ever employed in this era. Right, at least these were the forces dispatched to the siege of Calais, and the levy that we listed comprised roughly 23,000 men of the precisely 32,303 soldiers assembled there. They would end up campaigning with less than that. Predictably, the aforementioned amendments to the statute encountered significant oppositions in Parliament. I made a video titled English Field Army Strength of the 100 Years' War, in which we see that the habitual operating army in France was much smaller. Those were the famous chevauchés that in great part were also private enterprises, more or less backed by the king, partially subsidized, because there was all a mix of again, troops that were technically levied still as subjects of the King of England, and that were under the control of this or that commander. Was of course an English nobleman, some of the richest, more powerful in the realm, and of course, like, participating to the broader English strategy against France. Armies are dramatically smaller, right? Because they were predatory in nature, were meant to obtain quite contingent objectives. Nevertheless, important ones. Actually, the English strategy of the 100 Years' War was coherent, wasn't that bad at all. You read strange things sometimes on the internet, as if, I don't know, you can even evaluate the 100 Years' War as first of all, as a single war or something that, extending over more than a century long series of campaigns, like, could be simply even conceived by the same protagonist in the same way, or the same unified procedures. If anything, as we were saying before, the English military potential was higher, right? And so their armies could have been larger. But it is over the amendments to the aforementioned statutes that much of the resistance to such levying was manifesting in Parliament. In 1352, Edward was in fact obliged, and reluctantly so, to agree with the Parliament establishing that, quote, no one shall be compelled to provide men-at-arms, hobbilars, or archers except for those who already held land requiring such service, unless by common consent and enactment made in Parliament. Which, after the crisis hit the Ardus, of course, was also a bit like the direct consequence of the exhaustion of the country. And England was well managed at this point. Edward III was a hell of a ruler, not just a little thing like the greatest military genius in English history, the greatest and most complete English genius in English military history. But this tells you how just, of course, limited these countries were. England wasn't also that enormous, compared especially to France as a whole, which, as you know, as considering how the war went, it had already been going, doesn't mean much. The English could, of course, break the system. But there were intrinsic limits from both sides, and this is very beautifully shown. It's not much like a material limit. It comes close to that, but it's mostly a political one, and it's mostly the nobility that has something to say about this. Because, you know, one and another, they are at the head of the shires that have to contribute to this force. Thus, it's the indenture that we will see in another video that has the lion's share mostly in the period. Today we don't talk about the Wars of the Roses, other, of course, important moments in which apparently, in fact, also relatively large amounts of troops were recruited, even though actually the Wars of the Roses was much more elite. There are, in nature, there are some battles that are at least recorded having fielded pretty large amounts of men. Maybe there the chroniclers are exaggerating a bit too much. Nevertheless, I made a video about the tactics of the Wars of the Roses, and we observed also there how limited, after all, but for very specific political reasons, those numbers were. So that would be an ongoing contention leading to a notable decline in the use of levied troops during the 100 Years' War. Because the crisis, because the greater effectiveness of professional forces, overall, in spite of sort of the political perturbances, the greater, say, not absolute amount of wealth available, because the crisis was really that brutal, but the sovereign capacity to actually get the actual subsidies to fund other forms of expedition. So not having to squeeze the local population, but if anything, say in terms of manpower, but if anything of labor, you know, wealth in some way or another, that passed in the hands of the same nobility that had all the interest, as we were saying before, in certain circumstances to intervene in France or opposing that, depending on the political goals that they had within England. Now, the ratio of levied soldiers to retinues shifted dramatically from 5 to 2 at Calais in 1347 to 2 to 3 in the army organized for the campaign in 1359. So that's the moment, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, where you actually get more professional forces than levies. This is, again, absolutely normal. This is what is happening. It had already been happening. England arrives only slightly later, several years, but in other countries this is pretty much the same. Like basically the commoners disappear from the armies, and or they're radically shrinking in number, and you don't have, especially they're framed under probably the professional element just as an auxiliary force, as they had already been, but now in a disproportionate numerical fashion. The English, again, compensate in part because they don't have enormous armies, right? But the proportion of commoners, if you look at it, is pretty high still, because mostly they were cheaper units per se, mostly archers. So you tend to see probably also even more than what the English fielded in a broader sense. Because if you pick just the numbers, you don't take into account that often what, say, France fielded was individually more expensive than that. Because an archer costs less than, say, an armiger, right? But in certain circumstances, it can achieve more. We talked about also the French army of the 100 Years, where we saw what the problems really were, mostly deriving from these massive swings that normally the French state has throughout history, and that brings to at that point a lack of uniformity in the army organization itself. So it's not like they lacked forces, they fielded these massive armies outnumbering the English, but they were much looser in terms of internal cohesion than the English once were. So in that sense, the English were, as always, this is like the odds are very, very balanced, and this is in part because the English were not even committing overwhelmingly to the cause, or at least to that kind of expense. And again, with all the limits, England is smaller than France. It also has its issues. Scotland has basically affirmed itself by this point as a peer rival of England after centuries of quasi-subservience. Also, the connections with Ireland are, if not severed, but everything is shrinking in this crisis of the great medieval civilization, mid-14th century. So it's really a problem for everyone involved. That's also what produces that massive French crisis that the English can exploit this surgically. After the death of Edward III in 1377, these militias, the levies really were predominantly raised for service only within England, right? Addressing threats from rebels, the Welsh or the Scots, as we've seen, while making only rare appearances in France in small contingents. It's really the norm of the era. The second half of the 14th century witnesses the brutal affirmation of professionalism. It had already started in the last decades before the crisis, had, if anything, enormously accelerated from the phenomenon that had already been going on from centuries. So you can really see it from certain examples. For example, a few hundred archers participated in the 1369 expeditions to France. We're talking levies, right, recruited in this way. In 1373, portions of Lancaster's indentured retinue were provided by drafting archers raised to traditional commissions of array. In fact, what you realize is that all the indentured troops were, in a sense, a product of this crisis as a whole. It was those same peasants that would sort of reluctantly serve in the moment of great expansion of the country, of Europe, say in the 13th century, through this arrays, this conventional levy recruitment, that said no to this for especially overseas expeditions, etc., in the moments of the crisis, from a legal point of view, mostly because also those who ruled them would have the same interests, as they were so, as we've seen in England, fragmented into the local, in the attachment to the local seigneury. But the crisis bit them so hard at home that many of them impoverished, and would be the ones who, in order to make a living, would actually enlist in the indenture system. As we said before, this is, very much the case of Wales, that was not just a destroyed country by the English conquest, but on top of this suffering further crisis like the entire system, and so sending so many youth out there because they didn't literally know how to live, how to feed themselves. And many of them being that poorly skilled, that poorly equipped, like they would, however, be good archers. Because, again, the longbow is not a magic card or weapon or whatever. It's just actually something very overrated compared, of course, to the men-at-arms and to this other infantrymen that would also hold the line, as opposed to the missile that, yes, could be very useful in combined arms tactics, and without which you could have not really won, but that individually was of much cheaper and less relevant worth than the others. Troops serving on the continent were primarily organized through indenture at this point. It was the retinue, based on the indenture contract rather than the man impressed by a commission of outright that surpassed completely, right, and replaced de facto the feudal levies and became the backbone of the armies of the 100 Years' War. Reason for which we will see how the entire system worked in other videos. It's of course about England it's not like you have more in a strictly absolute documentary sense, but of course more has been written because the Anglo-Saxons took care of their own history more than other countries that are also better documented. So we can make so many videos as these branches of the English army that are complex, and that we can also see in action in other cases. I mean, if you look at the Battle of Poitiers video, it's a beautiful battle. First of all, it's one of the most beautiful that I've ever studied in military history. It has a lot. It was a perfect battle from the English side. The Black Prince was really something. That was his greatest success, as you know. If anything, proving that, because he wouldn't have such enormously equal striking successes without Poitiers. We would think slightly less than him. He was a great commander. Anyway, we will see the indenture. We see lots of things. Again, I've made just a few about, I would say also about the 100 Years' War in general. We did talk about that in a general sense, made this battle videos, but we haven't really savored it like in a deep fashion. I'm glad if we can look at all these details. I'm glad that we're talking a bit more about medieval England and medieval English warfare, because they're very, very, very important topics. I made 53 videos so far about medieval England. I wish I had made many more, right? Because I still feel like I haven't properly delivered the real vibe behind it all, right? And instead, there is really so much history and so much things, and to say it's embarrassing for me even. As I always say, speaking mostly to excuse me, I don't have a cold, but today, I don't know, if I don't sleep, I don't know why, but I get all my forehead inflamed, and I tend to lacrimate, and so, but today I felt awfully managing different things, exhausted, right? But this videos before sleep relax me, so that's my way to slow down, and I manage to recover as well. When I speak, I sort of heaten up a little bit, and this somehow has some sort of analgesic effect. Otherwise, I have a good health. So yeah, I don't know which video about medieval England will be next. Likely the one at least about, look, I prepared them in advance. It's the one about Edward I. I don't see, I mean, some aspect of Edward I's reign, his administration. I don't know, probably the full heat of the Scottish Wars, because we had just began that. The Malleus Scotorum is definitely one of my favorite kings. I think he was a hell of a ruler. I like him very much. I specialize in that period, by the way, so Longshanks is always that charming. And yes, I don't see many other medieval English stuff ahead, but you know, there are the specials as well. So I made Hastings recently, also that one about Henry I, Familia Regis, and I'll think of something, because I feel in the mood, to, especially during this time of the year, for English history. Something dark and romantic about it. For today, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.